Okay, so what's the question I can ask Marc that'll get him to speak for a long time, and Hartman as well? So, how about, what is new insight you developed around the intersectional nature of our struggles for freedom in the course, oh, this is for you, Marc, in the course of straddling the academy and the movement?
Okay. You're like, you're gonna get these 10 minutes. Good evening, everybody. Yeah. First of all, thank you all for inviting me. It's an incredible honor to be here as your friend, as your brother, as your comrade, as we begin this weekend's events with our minds fixed closely to freedom. And I think for me, just taking a step back, because I think that's a great question, thinking about Palestine in conjunction with all this other freedom work I've been doing, trying to be a part of, has been an interesting journey. For years, as a kid, I was part of movements, anti-police brutality movements, very young at the anti-apartheid rallies, Free Mumia rallies, and we continue to say free Mumia, free all political prisoners. The question of Palestine emerged a lot, but it wasn't central to what we were talking about. But we, almost intuitively, black folk knew what side to be on, at least the ones on the radical left. We understood where we should be thinking, although it was very, very complicated. The pull from the church, the pull from the Zionists. You go to historically black colleges and universities, and they're taking you on these APAC-sponsored tours. So you're getting pushed and pulled in a lot of ways, but there was a way that I was always thinking about Palestine. I think for me, one of the key moments was certainly 2014. It wasn't the first moment, but it was a major moment. And so it's interesting in your work and in your remarks that you also had us think about 2014. Because in 2014, I'm an academic. I'm a professor at Morehouse College at the time. And I also was on CNN. And then you have 51 days of disproportionate force. Well, it's every day of disproportionate force, but 51 particular days of disproportionate force in Gaza by the Israeli nation state. And in those 51 days, we covered it. This is pre-Trump, post-missing airplane, so we had some time to fill. And so we were covering this for a minute, and then I remember I was one of the few people on CNN who took a position that what Israel was doing was wrong. And those 3 days that they let me on the air to talk about it were great. After that, it's just back to, chief racism correspondent. And if you're watching the CNN, I'm just kidding. And one day I was debating Alan Dershowitz. I know, let it out, it's okay. And the apartheid word came up. And things started to shift a little bit. I haven't really been on to talk about it much since, seriously. I'm not saying it's a conspiracy, I'm just saying I haven't been on to talk about it much since, for whatever reason. And to be clear, by the defenders of US policy, I'm not suggesting in some cabal or anti-Semitic conspiracy. That's often what people think. I don't literally mean a conspiracy as much as a kind of attempt to limit the range of voices on this issue. It's not, yeah. So, but at that moment, it was fascinating to see what happened. One, as an academic, the president of my university calls me. One of 3 calls I would get over the next 3 years from a university president, from that university president, to question my position on the issues. Conversation starts with, we believe in academic freedom, however. And so I had to really start to think about what academic freedom meant and what it meant as an academic to occupy this space. On the other hand, while Gaza is at war, or war is being waged upon Gaza, there's an equally interesting moment that begins on August 9th, 2014 in Ferguson. And I was on the ground in Ferguson, and I was getting tear gassed, and I was struggling with folk and trying to cover it. And all these things are happening at the same time, and there are people who are saying, why are you worried about this Gaza thing when there's this Ferguson thing? That wasn't the dominant narrative, but it was a narrative. And so there was this moment where I felt in all the spaces that I occupy, I had to find a kind of position and a kind of legible response to the question of why I, as a black person in America, in a white supremacist, homophobic, patriarchal nation state, empire, would I be looking 10,000 miles away? Fortunately, there were a gang of wonderful comrades and activists who were also thinking through this work. You saw the birth of Black Lives Matter as a kind of force, as a national force. People like Patrisse Cullors, Alicia Garza, Opal Tometi, who were talking about these things, but very, very, very directly and accurately thinking about not just the local question, the national question, but also the international question, and not just the international question, but the transnational question. And so those black women helped me think through this stuff in very important ways. At the same time, there were people who were organizing with us, both in Ferguson and in Philly and in New York and in LA and all these places, who were talking about Gaza. And then who also were attempting to talk about Gaza in conjunction with the broader conversation about a free Palestine, because oftentimes people will try to isolate Gaza in the conversation about Palestine. And so we were having this robust, fuller conversation about Palestine and the relationship between that and there. And then for me, the key moment, and I don't want to go over my 10 minutes after complaining about talking, was when we went on the delegation. In January of 2015, I joined a delegation organized by the Dream Defenders. Yeah, get him some love, squad. And led by Ahmed Abu Znaid and Maytha al-Hassan. And what Maytha and Ahmed did was take a group of activists and scholars and organizers, and it was the most wonderful group of people you'd ever want to be anywhere with. And we traveled through Palestine. And when I say Palestine, I mean all of it, river to sea. And I'm just giving you a note ahead of time. So when I say Palestine, I'm talking about all of it. And we experienced things and we saw things and we had conversations with folk and we were able to understand solidarity in different contexts, but I was also in some ways forced to wrestle with the limitations of solidarity. For me, suddenly, solidarity didn't just mean, I feel you. It wasn't just about empathy. It had to be more complicated than that. But solidarity also didn't mean that it always had to be same. Sometimes solidarity we equate with sameness. Oh, I could relate to that, so I'm going to ride with you. And there were ways that I could understand it, particularly when we were in 48, and I could kind of understand this idea of denied citizenship, being denied access to certain places to live, being denied access to free movement within the nation state, having second-class citizenship, a second-class citizenship that's been codified this past summer with the nation state bill. So it's not even an illusion anymore. Second-class language, number 4. Point number 1, democracy, not even in the conversation about that, in terms of the vision of an Israeli nation state. Settlements, unfettered, unchecked. So I could relate to that kind of stuff. Then I went to Khalil, and I didn't have a point of reference for that. This idea of statelessness, I didn't have an exact reference point for. Not that black folk haven't wrestled with denied forms of citizenship at all points in America, but there was something different about what I saw there. And at that point, I realized that my connection to the Palestinian struggle wasn't one where I could say, yeah, I understand that, or my ancestors understood that, or my grandparents understood that, because we had a different story. It's not better or worse, it's not more or less severe, it's just different. And I was forced to wrestle with that difference, to sit there and linger in those contradictions, to have to sit there and say, I don't understand this, but it still matters, and it's still significant, and I have to just understand and learn. And in that space, I understood that my solidarity came from a space of silence rather than a space of active talking. I understood solidarity beyond the question of showing up. Because to some extent, it became almost transactional in terms of how we understood. I always understood it as kind of transactional. Folk who would say, well, yeah, you come to our rally, we come to your rally. Or you support our thing, we support your thing. And there were some real concerns, and this is an important concern now, you know, that sometimes we'd have these rallies for Black Lives Matter and Palestinians weren't showing up. Syrian brothers and sisters weren't showing up. And then Palestinians were sometimes saying to us, well, you know, we have stuff and y'all don't be there. I would go to college campus, they'd be like, you know, we support the BSU, but they're not coming out to our stuff as Arabs. And so in different spaces, in different contexts, the question of showing up mattered. And what I was trying to think about is, one, how we could learn more about each other's struggles so that we'd be invested in it. And that comes from political education. That comes from linking our struggles together so that I understand that I cannot be free, and not just in the cliche kind of left-wing sloganeering kind of way, I can't be free that everybody's free, but the idea that capitalism is a global project that has to be dismantled, that white supremacy is a global project that has to be dismantled. And the same way that people navigate the world carrying whiteness around like it's property, that doesn't just limit itself to the borders of the United States. In the Israeli nation state, you're watching the exact same thing in the very way as you write about very brilliantly in your own work, which y'all all need to read because she's a genius. This way that Israeli identity itself kind of hinges upon a particular idea of perfected whiteness and a kind of cleansing of a certain kind of European sensibility of a diminished citizenship and identity. So in other words, they own that white stuff too. There's no way to talk about neoliberalism without talking about not just the privatization of the market here, but also the way that the Israeli military works. There's no way to talk about policing without understanding the relationship between NYPD or Chicago PD and being trained by Israeli nation forces. So the connections are there. So this is the last thing I'm gonna say. We should be showing up because we need to show up. But I don't want to reduce activism or organizing or struggle to a transaction, because that's also capitalist logic, where I do for you, you do for me. This shouldn't be a quid pro quo situation. I should be struggling because it's the right thing to do. I should be struggling because your bodies, your lives, your struggle matters to me. And because it's inexorably tied to my own freedom. So I've been forced to have a more robust and ambitious freedom dream. One that's not limited to Philly or New York, although those are cool places to be, but one that's not limited to racial or gender politics exclusively, but one that is intersectional, but also transnational. One that is forward-looking, but one that's always deeply situated in history and has a deep sense of history. And one that understands the value of everyone's struggle, again, not just in the abstract, but in very concrete material ways that can allow us to be free as soon as possible. And so for me, as an academic, I had to take all that in against the backdrop of a hostile academy that didn't want me there anyway, but definitely don't want me there from talking this Palestine stuff. You know what I'm saying? And I had to navigate sometimes a activist space that wasn't sold on the Palestine thing for very real reasons that we can talk about later. So that's been sort of how I've been thinking about it, how this struggle has inspired me, but also has challenged me to think a little more critically and thoughtfully about these issues. Thank you.
So, you know, the bio that was read there earlier was a bio from an art show, and I'm also filling shoes last moment. It wouldn't necessarily have been the bio I would have sent in, although it's true and it's factual and it's me. But I've also had some time in academic settings, and so I wanted to, you know, be able to talk about some of that as well because it's relevant to the question. You know, I got my bachelor's in cultural education and community sustainability, and that's what I studied, and it was about how we educate each other. And I did this because I had spent years and years learning from lots of different sources and lots of different ways of learning. I've been a traditional person all my life, and I've learned from elders all my life. Lots of wisdom and knowledge that I got from my uncles and my aunties. They aren't necessarily my blood aunties and uncles, but you call them aunties and uncles out of a means of respect for the knowledge that they have to offer you, for the way that they hold the community together. I got to work in museums. I got to work with our tribal language project. And these are things that help hold people together. And yet, when I entered into the official academy, as we're talking about, there's such a bias in the academy that's so prevalent, that's once again about whiteness. It's about validating white sources of knowledge. It's not valid if I learn it from my auntie, but if my auntie tells a white man and he writes it down, then it's valid. Right? How does that work? And so much of what I had learned and I had absorbed from these teachers, these wise people that had so much to offer me, was completely dismissed out of hand because I couldn't cite it as a source in a book. And this comes down to so much else that's so problematic in this very issue, you know? As Native people, you know, we have a lot of knowledge about our land, our history, our interrelationship with our people, different people around us, and yet this is all dismissed. It's dismissed when we have deeds to our land. There's deeds to Wampanoag land that go back to the 1500s because we were some of the first people to learn to read and write. When the English got here, they wanted to teach us to learn the Bible. And the means to do that was to teach us the tools of reading and writing. And so we started to learn reading and writing, and by 1640, there was more Wampanoag people literate in the Wampanoag language, monolingual, than there were English people in New England literate in English. And so there's a vast wealth of documentation, and one of the documents they put out was a land transaction between these people's grandparents that they documented because they saw that the written word was what had started to become the power of law in our own land. And if we didn't have it written down, it wouldn't be honored, it wouldn't be respected, because that was the way that the colonial settlers dealt with things. If it was words on paper, that's what mattered. The old ways that we had done things were invalidated, just as the old ways of education were invalidated. The old means of knowledge were invalidated, and we're still struggling with this. We, as a people, as Wampanoag people, we are very fortunate to be on our homeland still. We are the people that gave you Thanksgiving. We're there where Plymouth Rock is in our homeland, and we're still there. And a lot of Native people can't say that. They've been pushed this way or that from the Indian relocation or from war or from whatever all else it is that's pushed them off their homelands. But we're very fortunate to be on our own homeland still. My father's on 2 acres of land that's never been owned by a white man ever. And yet, when it comes down to actualizing that into a real set of, rights and actually being able to show that we have an inherent right to the ground that's under our feet, we're called into doubt, we're called into question. We're invalidated because we only have the words of Indians to testify to this. We only have the knowledge of the Native people, that this land that we stand on, that we've always stood on, is still ours. Other than that, we go to the academy, to the systems of law in the United States, and they say, well, we don't know. We've got our checks and balances, and, well, it says this here and that there, and we can't validate that. We can't validate that. And so, we got to look at the academy itself and how they validate knowledge and sources of knowledge. and how that helps to contribute to, this systems of white supremacy, white heteronormative colonial patriarchy. And that's what we're up against. And it's one that divides people in many ways, but it always puts one select group on top. And it's a very small and exclusive group. And the rest of us are meant to bear the burden of their success. So that's one of the things I think that I've come to think about in regards to academy and other issues.
Can you keep the mic, Hartman, and answer the following question? So I also know, I apologize about your bio. I have to apologize.
No.
And be thankful to Hartman, who joined us at a very last minute because, yes, Hartman. Wazayit Tawan could not be with us, and Hartman graciously took this stage, and I butchered his bio. So that's me.
Don't worry about it. I like that bio. It's just not the one. It's for my art shows. That's all.
Okay. So, but Hartman, in addition, is also doing a panel on Sunday, a workshop about Native Palestinian solidarity. So, could you tell us a little bit about where Palestine fits into your own work, or into your political analysis, or into your spirituality, however it is? Where does it fit?
Well, for me, I grew up in an activist household, and I don't honestly remember when the issue of Palestine was first introduced to me. I remember it as being ever present in regards to the hypocrisy and double standards of the systems of power, and how justifications that are used to prop up the Israeli state subjugating the Palestinian people are the same things that are dismissed as Native people are trying to stand up here for our own rights. They say that it's a matter of God gave it to them and they deserve it, and they put them there in that land, and it was a long time ago, but it still holds true. And yet, when Native American people start talking about land claims and deeds, they say, oh, that was so long ago. That was so long ago. Why are you still holding on to that? So, when does it start to matter, and when does it stop mattering? At what point does justice expire? And when we're talking about the land that's under people's feet, the land that they stand on, the land that they're in possession of, as far as I understand it, almost all the time I've looked at, they say possession's supposed to be 9/10 of the law, except for when you're a settler and a colonizer, unless you're white. And then, in which case, then possession is not really so much of the law. You get to take what you want, and the rest of the people have to deal with and accommodate that. And that's what we've seen time and time again, and I relate so much to watching the Palestinian people struggle for the land that's under their feet, for the land where they're growing, the olives that their ancestors planted, and tending to these things, the people that are no longer with them. And I'm here on this piece of land where, it's been in our family since the original division of land. And we still have to struggle and maintain this and justify our existence here and be pushed back against because people want that land that's under our feet. And they find these justifications and these reasons and these excuses why it's okay to dispossess us of what we're in possession of. And so for me, this is something that's been ever present. And looking at our struggle as Native American people and the struggle of the Palestinian people is so interconnected and so complicatedly interwoven in a matter of so much the same as far as our treatment at the hands of the oppressors, and yet so drastically different in the justifications used to make these actions somehow excusable. So so this is something that, I don't know, it's been as long as I can remember in my political mind. It's been a part of what I've thought about and part of what I've looked at in the world, and as well as so much else, so much commonalities between us as people in our struggle.
I want to ask you each a question to share with us from obviously your practice and your studies, the art that you're envisioning, the work that you do, the communion you build. What are opportunities that you see for our joint struggle? It could, be something as tangible as a joint campaign, deadly exchanges, for example. It could be something like that. It could be something that has to do with what are we doing to preserve this earth, which is very much an indigenous issue, but it's also a human issue. How are we going to survive before we scorch it? Or alternatively, to think of challenges that you're facing, because sometimes through the challenges, we can also see new opportunities.
There are a few things that I think are interesting opportunities to connect, outside of just connecting just on its, for its own sake. I think when it comes to the liberation of Palestine, one space is BDS. I mean, I think the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement is an excellent opportunity to not just show solidarity, which obviously it does if you're engaged in BDS work, but it also kind of forces us to think and operate across waters, across boundaries, across borders, and to think really deeply about how we can work and do work in solidarity with folks. Because it's not enough to just engage in boycott, divestment, and sanction work, but to think and be strategic about what that work looks like in different contexts and in different spaces, I think forces us to work together in a different way. I'll be specific. When you're on a university campus, getting black student unions, for example, to work and organize and think about BDS, and to give them a sense of history, to situate that in a history of us struggling and organizing against apartheid, to get them to understand, think about the Montgomery boycotts here, to think about a long history of resistance work, but also to unsettle them and to force them to not be limited by a civil rights logic or framework that forces us to think very specifically and narrowly, to have a very low bar about what the state can do for us, but to be much more, again, ambitious in thinking about what's possible. To dream not just about a more just and fair nation state, but to even at some point, not tonight, but because it's a whole other conversation, but to even think about what it means to not have the nation state as our model. I mean, we can do that this weekend. I'm just saying, maybe not right now. Yeah, that's a Sunday conversation. So I think BDS for me has been an important way for us to organize and struggle and learn from each other. I think the Black Lives Matter movement has been another important intervention, particularly because so many of the policy goals, several of the policy goals, have been transnational in scope. And some have been specifically focused on the question of how do we liberate Palestine? What does justice look like in Palestine? And so I think when Palestinian brothers and sisters are working on Black Lives Matter work, you're still doing liberatory work for Palestine. You're still thinking about this. Another thing is the abolition movement. It's impossible for me to think about abolition as part of to use Robin Kelly's language, as part of my freedom dream. If I'm imagining a world without punishment as the primary measure of justice, right? When I think about abolition work, I think about a world where justice doesn't mean punishment, and punishment, and punishment doesn't mean confinement. That's important, to ask restorative questions, not who did it and how do we harm them, or who did it and how do we punish them, but rather who was harmed and how do we make them whole again. Those are different kinds of questions that force us to understand the world differently. When I understand the world from a restorative posture, not only do I want to decarcerate, not only do I want to excarcerate, But I'm also forced, I think, to think about broader questions about what collective punishment looks like and what it means for Palestinians both in 48 and in 67 to be collectively punished. I have to think about prison not just as this kind of thing that houses 2.3 million Americans, but also think about Gaza as an open-air prison, asking different questions about what captivity looks like. I can't just think about political prisoners here in the States. I have to think about political prisoners in Palestine. And I have to ask questions about what the face of those prisoners look like and what legitimate resistance looks like. Because I think part of the problem is when we struggle together, we too often adopt a civil rights tradition which romanticizes nonviolence. That's the challenge. This is the last thing I'm gonna say. That's the challenge. It romanticizes nonviolence. And how can you romanticize nonviolence when you have a state that is at all moments waging war against you, against your bodies, poisoning your water, limiting your access to water, locking up your children, killing you? We can't romanticize resistance. So for me, part of the challenge is when we start saying we shall overcome and holding hands and having sit-ins, which is important. It's an important and indispensable strategy, and I would never disrespect that strategy. We just can't fetishize that strategy. We can't fetishize that here in the States. To me, hands up, don't shoot was always problematic. Because this ain't the posture I want to have against a violent state. If I'm gonna do this, I ain't trying to be like this. I'm going Layla Khaled style, right? But, yeah, I know, I'm probably fired right now. But, fuck it, might as well get it done then, right? So, might as well go all the way. So, if that's the case, then that also means that it gives us, I think when we reject that framework, it allows us to stand in solidarity with Palestinians a little bit differently and understand what Palestinian resistance could look like. And also that challenge of understanding that the face of that resistance has to be somebody different. In the United States, it can't always be the black kid who was just about to go to Harvard he has two parents, and on Monday he was going to college, and he never got an F, he never got a C, he never smoked weed. Like, that shouldn't be the criteria necessary to not be killed by the police. We can't romanticize the face of resistance. But that also, I mean, I was in Palestine most of the summer, and I'm watching, I hit Tamimi, and again, shout out to her, support her, I love the work she's doing, and it's not her fault, this is not a critique of her as such, but a question, one, of what does it mean for that to be the face of resistance? What happens in the States when the face is trans? And not even trans that conforms to very narrow heteropatriarchal visions of womanhood. What does it look like when it's a trans body? What does it look like if it's a sex worker? What does it look like if it's somebody who never went to school? And similarly, what happens in Palestine when it's someone who's not traditionally attractive, who's not blonde? What does it mean when the person doesn't just offer a slap? Which we can almost understand and make cute, particularly coming from her frame and her body. But what does it mean to say, I shouldn't have to just slap a soldier that has stolen my land, destroyed my village, killed my children, locked us out since 1940. If that's your story, then a slap ain't all you need. But if that's the only resistance that we accept in a post-Oslo moment, then again, we're constraining and domesticating the resistance. So for me, the challenge is sometimes, and I'm not blaming this on the civil rights movement, I'm just saying that we've allowed this nonviolent thing to become so normative that we're undermining our own ability to resist in real robust ways.
Yeah, definitely, all of that, you know, because, yeah, the boycotts and the divestment work is super important. You know, these entities and these people, they don't care about our lives. They don't care about morality or ethics. They care about dollars and cents. That's all they seem to care about. So if that's all they care about, then that's the language that they understand. They understand the language of money, and they understand the language of violence. That's the language that they use. And, you know, to not be able to communicate with them in those languages, we're not communicating. And we're locked out of the conversation if we can't speak the same language. So it's important to be able to speak the same language, and it's important to be able to act as fully realized human beings. And sometimes being able to act with violence in a case of self-defense is righteous. And sometimes being able to react with anger is reasonable. It's not unreasonable. It's not inhuman. It's not wrong. I've always learned in my life that children are sacred, and yet, to see like how children are treated in Palestine, that children are killed, and that somebody can find some kind of justification to make this okay to themselves is inhuman. They think that they're dehumanizing us, but they're really dehumanizing themselves. And to see how we're treating children on the southern border, these are primarily indigenous children, whether they speak Spanish or whether they're monolingual Mayan-speaking children from Guatemala. These are indigenous children. These are not kids from Spain. I don't care if they speak Spanish. And the way that we're treating these children, it's terrible. And we have to be able to rise to the challenge. And we have to be able to make the sacrifices that are needed to get this world right. And sometimes that requires a real deep sacrifice of people. So, we need to move forward with that understanding. Divestment's super important, not only as far as Israel and the boycott, divestment, and sanctions there, but also with these oil companies. I mean, it's such a huge part of the problem for Native people and for the Arab world in general right now, because oil has been such a resource of empire for so long that it's caused people to do really crazy things in order to seek out the wealth that comes from that oil. So to be able to divest from oil and fossil fuels is super important and helpful, and I think a great way that we can have solidarity from Native people to Palestinian people. And I think that's super important. But it's also the land and the water too. Water is something that's in common throughout. I know that at a point, a lot of the people left from Standing Rock and went to Flint, and one of the things that the Tiger Swan Security Company made a great effort to do was to try to sabotage that effort through misinformation ahead of time to keep that alliance from forming strongly, because they realized how much power there would be in bonding over water. The fact of the matter is that this is a shared struggle that's not a matter of a Native issue or a black issue or a Palestinian issue, although this is an issue that affects all of us. And it affects all of us in very particular ways, whether they're shutting off the water going into Gaza, or whether you have the poisoned water in Flint, or the uranium in the water in Navajo, or the threat of the oil spilling in Standing Rock. All over the place, water is an issue, and it's a human issue that's fundamental to us being able to live. It's something like respect and truth that's more valuable than dollars and cents. And we seem to want to sell it at the cheapest price. And I don't know what kind of world we expect to have if we sell things that are so much beyond the value of money for just dollars and cents. So I think these are areas where we can come together around some baseline human issues, and not even just human issues. These are issues that affect life in general, and our ability to live on this planet. And if we start to remember what our human needs are, and start to assert what our human needs are as human beings all over the place, I think that we can start to look at the flaws of this capitalistic system, this white heteronormative colonial patriarchy that only wants to see some few people that fit all of those boxes together. If you fit all those boxes, you can have stuff. If you don't fit all those boxes, if you have one of those boxes that aren't checked, well, we can come for you and we can come for what you have. You know, we need to change that. And I think that these are some good places to start.
Do y'all want to share with us any final thoughts? I have final thoughts, but...
Okay.
My bad. One, this is such an exciting time. Despite all the, I feel bad because I'm sitting there like, yo, I whispered to yo, can I get a final word? Because I almost felt bad like leaving on such a, I don't want to leave on a down note. I get somber sometimes, man, thinking about how much work we got to do. But at the same time, I've never felt more optimistic. I remember where was here. I was here about 8 years ago, maybe, with Angela Davis. And we were doing a talk on prisons. And Angela Davis, who's also been obviously an extraordinary ally for the Palestinian struggle, said to me, she said, you know, this is so special to me because she said 30 years ago, I couldn't even have a talk at a university on prisons. It was like a taboo thing at a university to be talking about prison. And now, we were at Gustavus Davis, as a matter of fact. And she said, the fact that we can talk about this and this is an issue means that we have moved the needle. And it doesn't mean our work is done, but it means that we're in a space where we can start to do that work. And I feel very similarly about this work right here. There was a moment where I wouldn't have seen this many people in a room talking about Palestinian liberation. It was a time where I couldn't get black folk to organize around this issue. And so I am genuinely excited at the possibilities that lay in front of us. But we have to be honest and we have to be self-critical. I'm gonna tell you one more quick story. I was at an event maybe 4 or 5 months ago. Nancy Mansour was with me from Existence is Resistance. Shout out to Existence is Resistance. And we're working on a documentary together called Black in the Holy Land. And after we gave a talk or whatever, this woman came over to me, a Palestinian woman, and she said, "You are wonderful. I love your work. Thank you for what you're doing." And she said, and I was telling her about my research in Jerusalem with Afro-Palestinians, and she said, "Oh, those Afro-Palestinians, they are wonderful people. They are so nice and so beautiful and so smart. They are not like the blacks here." That's what I said. And I was like, I'm one of the blacks here. And I didn't know what to do. And she was like, no, but you're different. You're beautiful. Like she's just digging, right? And the organizer tried to pull her away, like Khalti, we got to go. And nobody really intervened. Nancy, I told Nancy the story. She was ready to intervene. Y'all know Nancy, she's ready to intervene. But there's this moment of like, obviously there's the kind of discomfort and humiliation and shame of kind of anti-black racism, having to deal with it in a kind of immediate moment. But there's also the question of what does it mean to do that when you're coming somewhere as an ally? We have to confront anti-black racism. We have to confront white supremacy, We have to confront homophobia. We have to confront transphobia. In this movement, not in the abstract, in this movement, we must. But in the same way that 3 black women were able to help animate a force, almost a force of nature in the United States to scream Black Lives Matter, 2 of them queer women of color, to be able to do that couldn't have happened 20 years prior. The fact that that could happen now meant that we had the possibility to do a whole lot of stuff that we could not have imagined previously. Similarly, I believe that at this moment, we have the ability to have an anti-colonial struggle in historic Palestine, a transnational struggle against Israeli occupation, that we can free the prisoners, we can free the captives, that we can do all of this work in a way that we've never done before, in a way that is wholly just and fair and intersectional. I believe we can do that work despite how dark the moment is, despite embassies being moved, despite anti-Arab sentiments, despite these anti-Arab immigration bills and anti-refugee bills, despite all of that bad news. I have never been more certain that we will win. I have never been more certain that we will claim victory. Free Palestine.